CTV's W5.
It was a prison. It was straight up, it was a prison.
Ruined childhoods and the struggle to find justice.
Threw me down 3 flights and put the boots to me.
I want somebody to tell me what they did to me was wrong.
And
I remember thinking, this is beautiful.
a lifelong mission to understand the giraffe.
To me, Anne was like a mythological creature.
It doesn't look like any other animal in the whole world.
Anne was way ahead of her time.
Here is Avery Haynes.
Welcome to W5. It could become one of the largest class action lawsuits in Canadian history. Thousands of children in Quebec who were either orphaned or abandoned by their parents have joined forces as adults in a search for justice. Sandy Rinaldo investigates their horrifying claims that the government-run institutions in charge of protecting them did anything but.
It has taken 50 years for Keith Villeneuve to even talk about it.
It's not that I'm stronger than anybody, because I'm not.
He's carried a heavy burden his entire adult life.
I can't remember too many times that I ever laid in bed and felt sorry for myself and said, why me?
But now Keith is taking control, fighting back to reclaim what he says was a lost childhood.
I'm telling my story because I'm at an age now I'm not so embarrassed about it.
Not embarrassed now to share the deep, dark secrets that still haunt him. The years tossed from one Montreal foster home to another from the time he was 18 months old and his parents divorced.
You went into the system, an innocent child. You went into the system because there was no one to look after you. Your parents couldn't look after you. Your grandmother couldn't look after you.
Right. I didn't know who my mom was, let alone my grandparents. And so I went in foster homes that were not always the best either.
Instead of protection and nurturing, he says his foster parents abused him.
So no biological family you can count on.
There was no support system whatsoever.
No support system. You go into foster care and there you find yourself a victim as well.
There was a foster home I lived in and that woman had a bad habit of beating you senseless with a stick. And I remember running out, yelling and screaming and swearing and saying every word that I didn't know I knew, but apparently I did. And within 30 minutes or so, a small car showed up with a social worker.
Keith was just 11 years old when, as a safer alternative to foster care, he was placed in one of the many institutions run by the province of Quebec. Places designed to protect thousands of children. But what happened behind the closed doors of those facilities will shock you.
I mean, whether it was waking you up in the morning and beating the hell out of you or throwing your bed on the ground, that's assault. That affects you somehow.
Keith ended up at Wardell House in Montreal's Tony Westmount district. It opened its doors in 1930, but has roots that stretch back to 1907. This brochure for Wardell House from the mid-1970s paints a picture of an idyllic lifestyle for a young man. It was anything but idyllic. About 200 boys lived in shared quarters, some juvenile delinquents, others runaways, orphaned or in need of protection from an abusive home or whose parents couldn't care for them.
Describe to us what you did on a daily basis at Wardell. What was that like?
So they'd come in and wake you up, generally violently, clean yourself, you'd have your breakfast, and then they would check you off before you left the building to go to school.
But at night, back at the house, shockingly, many of the boys became targets for the staff whose job it was to protect them.
It wasn't a healthy environment. The one I remember the most is I was in the hospital for 3 days, and a staff member came into the kitchen area, the dining room area. Well, he grabbed me, threw me down 3 flights, and got me underneath a bolted-down bench that was in the basement and put the boots to me.
Violence, intimidation, mental torture, even sexual assault.
The sexual assaults that happened, and that went on for a long period of time.
You were sexually assaulted?
Yes, I was. You know, you can only say F off so many times and they're still coming back at you at night. And we had dormitories and they were in the dormitories doing this. And if I had turned around and fought the person off, they were going down, you know, 5 beds down and they were doing the same thing to somebody else. I remember complaining to a staff member who later did the same thing, and he was a pedophile. Okay, start with
that's
left.
Not what they want to do, though.
No, we'll just do it for fun.
It's the guilt and shame Keith still lives with that makes this day special, but still difficult. Keith has returned to Wardale House with 3 lifelong friends he grew up with here in the 1970s.
We can't get any closer unless we're
We're delinquents. We're older delinquents.
It's a relatively upbeat reunion, but only because they all survived the horrors of what went on behind those doors.
Right there where it's kind of marred right now, or sandblasted maybe, it used to read Wardale House, the doors to opportunity.
Just being physically close to the building does stir up wretched memories.
It was bad because you'd have staff coming in to try to sodomize you or to do oral sex on you or a hand job on you. You'd turn around and say, F off, and I remember doing this, telling this guy repeatedly, F off, F off. So after that, you're not going to tell your friends what's going on, and you're not going to tell another staff because now you're fearing what's going on. You fear, you feel either guilty or shameful or whatever. We're lucky. Yeah. Paul, we just regained some friendship last summer at the camp, right?
Paul Fontaine was in Wardale with his brother, a brother who died by suicide after he left.
Seeing these guys today, listening to them talk, it's you have a friendship that never died, There's a bond there that can't be taken away. And I hadn't thought about Wardale really much after leaving. Started talking about it again, and I found it very challenging, very painful.
Although not everyone was harshly treated, these 4 men claim they were. They represent a fraction of the thousands who lived in institutions under the care of the Quebec government. It has taken decades to begin sharing their stories.
Yeah, the only staff I remember who wasn't really a pedophile was the one who looked like he would have been the most.
Oh, no, man, I woke up one night, I was in 3rd center, and he had his hand down my pants, and when I woke up...
Who?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Wow.
See?
Oh, yeah.
Just things we don't know. 60 years later, because growing up, you all are friends. We're all together when we grew up. I wasn't going to tell him that this or was turning around and playing with my private parts. You're too embarrassed. You're too ashamed.
Oh, yeah,
You're not. I'm not. I never said a word until I was in my late 50s. I never said a word.
In the fall of 1922, when the boys at the Shawbridge Boys Farm and Training Center gathered to watch the raising of the chapel bell, there were less than a handful of juvenile institutions in Quebec. That number would eventually grow to include 117 facilities in the province. And the institutions were not exclusively for boys.
My parents were alcoholics who abused us quite a bit.
Darlene O'Keefe had no choice but to end up in foster care. For her, it was an escape from a violent family who didn't want her.
My mom passed away when I was 10, and so then I was living with my dad and my stepmother, and they were hurting us. I mean, they broke my sister's finger for losing a button on her coat.
Darlene began running away from the beatings, and then one day when she was 13, she got caught stealing lipstick from a local pharmacy. A police officer gave her a break and drove her home instead of to the police station.
So when they brought me home, he pulled up and my stepmother was on the balcony and just said, take her away, take her away. And I still remember the cop. He was like, but madame, you don't understand. And she's like, I don't care, take her away, take her away. So that night, I told the police officer everything that had been going on in my house, everything that had been going on at school. And at about 10 o'clock at night, he was like, you know what? Nobody's gonna hurt you again.
That police officer had no way of knowing how wrong he was. The cycle of physical and sexual abuse continued from one foster home to another. Darlene was eventually placed at the provincially run Girls' Cottage School, where she says she was bullied relentlessly until she couldn't take it anymore and began to run away. It was a pivotal point for 12-year-old Darlene, now officially classified as a runaway. A judge decided she needed to be sent to a place called Marion Hall, another government-run institution for girls in Beaconsfield, Quebec. Tell me about Marion Hall. What was that like?
It was a prison. It was straight up, it was a prison. They couldn't give a flying fig about what happened to us. We were prisoners. We were not to be, they did not show us any caring or compassion or, hey, this is a child.
According to Darlene, the #1 form of punishment at Marion Hall was the quiet room.
They used the QR as a punishment. It was supposed to be, for your protection and safety or the safety from others.
Let me ask you this, is the quiet room the same as solitary? Because you seem to spend a lot of time in solitary.
Yes, it's an isolation room. Yeah, it was just a continuous level of abuse and emotional terrorism and all that from people who were supposed to be protecting you.
For Darlene and Keith, the anger and shame of what they experienced in the homes can sometimes bubble over. When you're describing all of this, it's almost like you go into the system an innocent child.
Right.
You know, you had no family to speak of. You went through foster care. You endure this kind of abuse. There's no one you can speak to. How do you come out of that and be able to function?
Coming up,
That's what they did. They beat you up to control you.
exposing the cruelty and neglect
I'm ready to stand up for all of us.
when W5 continues.
It has taken decades for Keith Villeneuve to face his demons. He hasn't even shared all the details with his partner, Michelle. In foster care since the age of 18 months, Keith was physically and sexually abused, eventually ending up at a youth facility called Wordale House in downtown Montreal. That's where the violence escalated.
My shoulders to this day are not very, very good, but I attribute that to getting beat up by these staff members at the time, because that's what they did. They beat you up to control you.
Although they still harbor bitterness and hate at the individuals who inflicted so much physical and mental pain, their anger is now directed elsewhere. Darlene, when you look back at that time, when you look back at your time in Marion Hall and in Shawbridge, who do you blame for all your misery and suffering?
Government of Quebec.
Both Darlene and Keith say the Quebec government needs to be held accountable for the abuse they suffered. They've joined what could become the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. Lawyer Lev Alexiv is taking on the Quebec government for its treatment of children in care at 116 different institutions.
Well, we don't have the exact number yet, which is usually the case in class action cases. But the indications that we have is that on any given year, there are thousands of kids in these youth facilities. So we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of potential members.
In his application to the Superior Court in Montreal, Lev describes a litany of abuse, including children being sexually touched, caressed, and kissed on the lips by a male guard. The application details assault, sexual assault, unnecessary medication, even children being enticed into developing a nicotine addiction, and in several cases, the use of solitary confinement. You know, you've been hearing some horror stories from some of these clients. Share with us what they're telling you.
We're talking about severe abuses being inflicted on kids who were in need of protection. And the troubling part for us in this case is the government has been informed about these abuses very early on.
I never really dreamt that this would happen, and I'm ready. I'm ready to stand up for all of us.
Ellie Lindsay is the lead plaintiff in the class action. It was her story that got the ball rolling. Ellie says she was a good kid, but 4 years in the youth protection system broke her.
I have flashbacks on a daily basis. To this day, I have flashbacks. I have nightmares. I have what they call night terrors. What if it was your child that was abused by somebody, and this is how they protected them, by putting them in there and locking them down and drugging them and abusing them? There's so many people who've never had an opportunity to even tell their story, you know, especially to somebody that's going to just listen and believe you, not judge you for it. You know, there's thousands of people like us, and somebody has to do something. This has to stop.
How many of you ended up in detention because of family issues like abuse or neglect? A show of hands, please. It remains to be seen how many people will take part in the suit, but there are thousands who grew up in the system. W5 set up a virtual town hall with a cross-section of victims like Ellie, Darlene, and Keith, who've signed up with the class action and are looking for justice. I'm trying to wrap my head around why young people, because when you went into these homes, you could have been as young as 8 or 9 or 10 years old and there until you're 18. Why would people who were there to ostensibly take care of you mistreat you this way?
Most of the staff were no more than a few years older than most of us. They were babysitting, and the only tool they had was cigarettes or like to get the right behavior.
A lot of the staff were struggling with the same demons and struggles that we had, and the staff weren't properly educated on how to identify each of our problems.
How many of you were locked up in solitary confinement?
You were never introduced to program without at least a small stint of solitary.
3 days in the quiet room after being molested by one of the staff. And it took 4 of them to throw me in there.
I wasn't sent there because I was a juvenile delinquent. I was sent there for help, and they locked me up.
It was just a board on the floor with a little thin mattress and a piss bucket in the corner, and they left me there for 3 weeks.
Oh my God.
W5 spoke to the 25 former institutionalized kids for more than an hour and a half.
They would make me kneel on a board of nails just because I peed my bed.
Their stories were truly heartbreaking. Memories of sexual abuse, solitary confinement, and the loss of self.
My heart's just breaking when I hear the stories of the other people who went through so much worse than me. I'm grateful. Today I have a pretty good life, but some of these other people, they're just so ruined by this system.
My hope is that the lawsuit is successful for all of us, but there's no amount of money that can ever settle any account with what transpired in any of these juvenile facilities.
The class action lawsuit is awaiting authorization, and depending on the number of participants, lawyers working on the claim say the award could easily run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The suit alleges that the government of Quebec was aware of the abuses in the homes as early as the 1970s and did nothing to stop it. W5 reached out to Quebec's Attorney General, who's named in the suit, and the Minister of Health and Social Services to request an interview. Both the Attorney General and the Minister declined to comment. Child care advocates claim the abuse issues inside the youth facilities are not restricted to the past. They point to a 25% increase in complaints last year alone. Calls for an overhaul to the system after the death of a child in care resulted in a provincial public hearing last summer. The inquiry heard from several experts and witnesses. Its findings have been delayed until next spring. But child care advocate Leith Hamilton is not optimistic.
They rearranged the deck chairs on the Titanic. Usually after all these outrages where kids have died, where they're sexually abused, there's some horrific behavior, that there's public outrage, there's a demand for change, something happens, and then a couple of years later, they're right back to the same thing. Well, why? One is kids don't have a voice.
Leith not only grew up in Wordale House, but he became a social worker and actually went back there as a staff member. He is still actively involved as an advocate and a counselor for kids in the system.
I've heard stories of emotional and physical abuse that date back to the 50s, right? And here we are in 2020. Is it still going on?
The bottom line for the system is to keep kids in line. They have power. If they're not empathetic and sensitive, they use that power for their own self-interest rather than the kids' interests. So a lot of kids are just treated in a very authoritarian system. As a society, this is just the way we treat people.
Leith says the class action suit is a good start, but real change can only happen when the government does a better job of engaging with families.
Nobody ever asks the parents what could be done to change your situation. It's $60,000 a year for placement. If my mother was given $60,000 when I was in trouble, she could have sent me to Harvard. She could have sent me on a trip around the world. The state cannot be a good parent.
After a 25-year career in the military and 3 failed marriages, Keith Villeneuve finally feels like a huge weight has been lifted off his shoulders.
People look at you now and you're a man telling a story and they say, suck it up. But they don't realize, look at your 12-year-old son and say that, because that's what I was.
As for Darlene O'Keefe, she wants her day in court.
You got involved in this class action lawsuit. What do you hope is going to come out of it?
I want somebody to tell me what they did to me was wrong. I want somebody to tell me that I didn't deserve to be treated like that, that I didn't deserve it.
Lawyers were expecting to have authorization from the courts to proceed as early as this spring, but the pandemic may force a delay.